I still don't know whether I should actually do that, because at some point my students and my colleagues at university will see this. But, okay, I hereby admit that I was terrible in math at high school. My teachers, they didn't put a lot of faith in my abilities, and certainly they didn't think that one day I would become a professor in finance, make a living out of writing mathematical papers, and do research in artificial intelligence. But when I was at university, I was attending this lecture called The Philosophy and History of Mathematics. And I learned that mathematics is actually much more than just a collection of formulas. It is a universal tool that allows us to solve problems. And actually, not just theoretical problems, but real-world problems. And at that point, mathematics became my passion. At the age of 38, I was a professor at Imperial College, and it became clear that I would return back to my home country, Switzerland, with all the beautiful mountains. And I did something which I've never done before. I bought a pair of climbing shoes. And I still remember my first climb and how unrelaxed I felt, and I still hear the laughter of my friends. It was a lot of fun for them, but nevertheless, it did not discourage me. So actually, 3 years later, I was climbing with a different set of friends, the Eiger North Face, which is a very dangerous route in the Alps, also known by the name Murder Wall or Mordwand in German. And 2 years later, we were tackling the El Capitan in Yosemite Park. And there were moments when I felt that it's impossible. But we never gave up. And after a couple of days and nights sleeping in an overhanging wall, we reached the summit. And this feeling, standing up there on the mountain, it's just indescribable. But more importantly, what these experiences taught me was that we should never give up. We should always face challenges head on and with an open mind. And indeed, a quote by Mark Twain serves me as an inspiration. And he said, "They did not know it was impossible, so they just did it." And today, me and my research team, we face a huge challenge, and probably the biggest challenge of humanity, climate change. But then, hey, why do you think that somebody like me, with a background in mathematical finance, should deal with climate change? Well, the fact is, when I returned to Switzerland, something unexpected happened, which could also happen to a rock climber. I fell. I fell in love with my wife, and we founded a family with 2 wonderful children. And besides changing diapers, this brings new responsibility into your life. And I started contemplating, what kind of legacy would I leave behind for my kids when they grew up? Would I tell them that I have educated generation after generation of investment bankers? Or could I tell them something more meaningful, more impactful? So I had to make a decision. And I decided for the latter one. But where to start? Our society faces so many challenges. And I chose climate change for one particular reason. Climate change, at its root, is an economic problem. Climate science tells us that climate change is human-made, but more precisely, it is caused by our economic activity. And economic activity gets coordinated in financial markets. And this is my area of expertise. So let's start with textbook economics. Textbook economics tells you that there is this magic invisible hand that solves everything by attaching the right price tag and allocating capital where it is most needed. So can it solve climate change? One necessary prerequisite for this magic hand to work is that we have all information available at all times and for all the stakeholders so that we can make economic decisions. Unfortunately, in the case of climate change, companies have been very, very active in providing us with the climate-relevant information in corporate sustainability reports and so on and so forth. And today we also have different climate initiatives like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD. And by now, there are about 4,000 companies that support the TCFD. And the TCFD gives companies a framework in which they have to report their climate-relevant information to the stakeholders. So it seems that it's just a matter of time, and eventually the market will solve the problem of climate change. Do you think so? Well, the truth is that CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is climbing all the time. There's no change in the trend, and also there's no change in the trend in global temperature rise. So something clearly goes wrong here. But what exactly is it that goes wrong? Let me give you two anecdotal examples for my arguments. The first anecdote is about a lunch that I had with the chief corporate sustainability officer of a large global company, and probably unintendedly, he told me how they produce these corporate sustainability reports. And he said that, well, you know, I get the first version, and then I send it back to the team, telling them that you should adopt much more vague language. And he does that a couple of times. So in the end, this report degenerates to some useless piece of a marketing brochure. So let me ask you then, how can we solve climate change if we do not get the decision-useful information from the corporations? And the second example is a sustainability conference that I attended last year. And there was the CEO of, again, a global company, and he presented by how much they reduced their core emissions over the last year. And he said that they reduced it by 8.5%. And of course, the crowd applauded. Great. But what went unnoticed is that these were only the core emissions, but not the total emissions, including Scope 3. And the total emissions of that company are 25 times higher than the core emissions. And moreover, over that last year, the total emissions of that company were rising by 8%. So let me ask you again, how can we solve the climate crisis if we are only told a fraction of the truth and not the whole truth? And unfortunately, these two examples is representative for the whole economy. Companies, they don't walk their talk, and when they talk only vaguely. But to be fair, it's not all the companies that are like this. But then the question is, how can I separate the walkers from the talkers? And here is where our work comes in. Back in 2019, we started to analyze corporate communication. So we wanted to create a transparent and accountable system. And of course, we are only humans. So no human could ever read all this corporate communication and corporate reports, annual reports, earning calls, and so on and so forth. So we had to look for an ally. And thanks to our mathematical mind, we found an ally in artificial intelligence. So what we did is we created an algorithm which we christened ClimateBird. And ClimateBird is based on the BIRD algorithm, which was published in 2018 and stands for bidirectional encoder representation from transformers. But you don't need to understand the technical details. But whenever you use your iPhone and you search something on your preferred search engine, you're actually using ClimateBird. And BERT works so well because it understands the context of your query. What does that mean? Let's say if I have 2 sentences, or if I say to my wife, hey darling, I take the kids and I go down to the riverbank, or if I say to my wife, hey darling, I take the kids and I'm going to rob a bank. These are 2 different meanings for the word bank, right? And depends on the context. So BERT is smart enough to differentiate between the context. So then, what is ClimateBird? ClimateBird is an algorithm that we further trained by exposing it to lots of climate-related text. And by doing so, the algorithm started to understand the climate-relevant context. And we then further fine-tuned the model so that it can identify commitments by companies in earning calls, in annual reports, and so on and so forth. And moreover, we trained the model so that it can identify whether a commitment is specific or just pure boilerplate. And with this algorithm, we then created what we call the CTI, because in finance you always have 3 acronyms, and the CTI stands for the Cheap Talk Index. And the Cheap Talk Index is basically a measure that tells you how much vague language a company is using in their communication to the stakeholders. And we then analyzed about 1,500 companies and found, for instance, that in 2020, every second company had a Cheap Talk Index above 50%. What does that mean? That means that for these companies, at least every second commitment that they make is just pure boilerplate and therefore useless, absolutely useless information. We then analyzed the whole time series, and the results that we got there were even more striking and concerning. And I'm going to focus on 3 of them. So first, we found that cheap talkers, they like to support climate initiatives because it gives them a convenient avenue to improve their public image without making tangible commitments to real action. The second finding that we found is that cheap talkers have higher emission increase. So they use these nice words in the communication to stakeholders to hide their negative environmental impact. And third, cheap talkers have much more negative media attention. That is, they are much more in the media because to some environmental incidents. So therefore, cheap talkers have a higher reputation risk, which then eventually leads to higher financial risk. So overall, what our work has shown is that words do matter, but words can be deceiving. And with a tool like ClimateBird, we can actually differentiate the walkers from the talkers. And the good news is that we open source this tool on our website, chatclimate.ai, so that everybody can use it. Regulators can use it, investors can use it, stakeholders can use it, and also you can use it. So ladies and gentlemen, with the looming threat of climate change, we need bold actions and visionary ideas. My own experience with climbing and math taught me the value of persistence in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. But of course, climate change is a much bigger problem. And for that, we need to rewire and exploit the immense potential that artificial intelligence offers. And maybe one day, somebody of you will give a TED talk with the title, How We Solved the Climate Crisis, and with the opening line, we did not know it was impossible, so we just did it. Thank you.